I just love having the Gospel of Mark to work with. It's so nice and straightforward. I say to you, watch. Watch, because you don't know if something's going to happen, be it day or night. So let's seek clarity for that statement in church history, or to be more precise, a kind of history that involves the church, the history of war. There's a thing that has existed for about as long as we've had cities. It's called siege warfare. You can't really lay siege on a farming village. So a siege is something that we had once we had armies and cities with walls. And the formal definition is thus. From the Latin word to sit, siege warfare is a form of constant, low-intensity conflict with one party holding a strong, static, defensive position. So what that means is when you have a siege, it means you have one army outside the walls of a city or fortress. You have one army inside the city walls or fortress. The first army can't get in, the second army can't run away, and therefore they sit there until something happens, which is generally one side running out of food or supplies, or the first army somehow getting into the walls. So, that's my little primer. Let's go back to the year 845 AD. At this point in history, Christianity controlled most of Europe, but there were still non-Christian attackers, here and there. And one constant enemy to be afraid of were the Vikings, who were not Christian. So in the year 845 AD, 120 Viking ships, so that's several thousand Viking warriors, snuck their way up the major rivers of France and laid siege on the city of Paris. And it didn't take them long to break the siege, to break through the defenders, and they invaded the city on Easter Sunday. And they did what Vikings do. They raided and pillaged the city until the French paid them a ton of money to go away. And that's all very sad, of course. And as far as I can tell, it's not the fault of the watchmen. The invaders were so overwhelmingly powerful, keeping watch, like Jesus said in the gospel, probably wouldn't have done all that much good. So, again, all of that's very sad. And by way of mention, for fun, they also attacked a few helpless monasteries along the way, just because that's what Vikings do. It really makes you wonder where God was in all of that. But the story doesn't end there, because a plague broke out in Paris during the siege, and the Vikings took it home with them. And that plague did a whole bunch of damage to those Vikings until one of their Christian prisoners, the Vikings took prisoners, by the way, one of the prisoners said that they should fast and pray for mercy. The Vikings, having run out of ideas, gave it a try, and indeed the plague subsided. And the leader of that raid on Paris, his name was Ragnar. Great Viking name, Ragnar. Ragnar would boast about how easy it was to conquer the city of Paris as he'd show off his mountain of loot. And then with tears in his eyes, he said the only resistance he found was by way of a long-dead saint, which was Saint Germain of Paris. One of the monasteries they attacked was built in his honor. So the Christians had such a powerful effect on those Vikings after the siege that once the danger of the plague, went down, all the Christian prisoners of the Vikings at that time were released. And the story still doesn't end there, because the survivors of that siege in Paris knew that the Vikings would be back before long, and keeping watch, they rebuilt the city, knowing the Vikings would be back, and the Vikings did come back. And the city walls held, and the city remained successfully defended against the largest force of Vikings the city ever saw in human history. And that happened only 40 years later from the siege of Paris in 845. Now, I'm sorry, but this stuff fascinates me. Because this is the kind of stuff that allows the church to survive in history while being surrounded by enemies and invaders. Why would a Viking king talk about a Catholic saint as the greatest source of resistance he ever met? That makes no sense. All right? Viking warriors believe in strength and blood and not much else. But the strength of a true saint and the piety of truly saintly people is hard to deny. They're the sort of people that prove victorious when all else seems lost. And it's because saints and saintly people know how to keep watch. They keep watch before the battle. They keep watch during the battle. And like the case of the siege of Paris with those Christian prisoners, they kept watch after the battle. They kept watch after the battle. The city was invaded on Easter Sunday. All right, a total mockery of religion if there ever was one. And I'm willing to bet that a lot of people in Paris gave up on Jesus that day. Can't say that I blame them. But nevertheless, we are called to keep watch. Called to keep watch for Christ at work in our lives. The siege of Paris was terrible, but the Vikings paid dearly for their bloodlust. The wicked got what was coming to them until those Christian prisoners showed them a better way. And the survivors of the siege also kept watch after the battle because they had children and grandchildren, and those grandchildren were attacked by Vikings in a very similar way, and they won. They won, and the city was safe because they kept watch. So, parents and grandparents, I have just one question for you today. How far would you go to keep your family safe? If it meant keeping your grandchildren safe in the future, would you march into battle? Would you take your chances with siege warfare? Would you let bad people steal every last dollar from your home if you knew that your grandchildren would never have to experience something like that because of you? I have to believe that your answer would be, yes, Father Justin, to all of the above. If it means a better world for the next generation, then bring it on. That is Christ's message today. Keep watch. Sure, keep watch for Vikings if you think it'll help, but keep watch for Christ. Keep watch for the chance to add holiness into the world whenever you can. Keep watch for the chance to resist the forces of darkness and evil when they come knocking, and come knocking they will. Keep watch. For the sake of the weak, the helpless, and those to come later, keep watch.